right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Mazie, and I'm a professor of legal writing at Marquette Law School. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the moderator for today's session, which is titled Gender, Power, and Pedagogy in the Pandemic. This session focuses on issues related to how we are teaching during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly teaching as it intersects with the other two concepts, gender and power. We wanted to consider how we, in our capacity as law professors, are adapting our teaching as the world around us changes. We initially conceived this session to focus on the COVID pandemic, but I think what we'll see as the presentations go on is the intersection of gender and power with other pandemics as well, including racism and other social and economic inequalities. I'd like to, before we begin, thank Professors Lolita Buckner-Innes, Cindy Fontaine, Suzanne Kim, and Kaylin Rami. The five of us formed a subcommittee that reviewed all the proposals that came in this summer last summer as a response to our call for presenters. And we believe we've put together an interesting and informative session for you today. So here's how we plan to proceed. First, in the interest of time, I'll only briefly introduce our speakers. Each speaker will have roughly 10 minutes or so to present. And in the meantime, I will be monitoring the chat, and we encourage you to put your questions there. And as we go along and touch on different topics, we encourage you to, in the chat, share as much or as little as you'd like of your experiences as we go through. And then finally, at the end, we're planning on 10 minutes where I will present those questions to our speakers. And now for the introductions. First, we have Professor Bridget Crawford and Professor Michelle Simon, and they will begin our session. Professor Crawford is a professor of law at the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. She teaches courses in taxation, feminist legal theory, among other topics. Professor Simon is a professor of law and the former dean of the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. Professor Simon began her career as a legal writing instructor, bless you, and now teaches principally in the areas of civil procedure and law and education, areas that are also the primary focus of her scholarship. Professors Crawford and Simon conducted a national survey of law professors in May 2020 about professors' teaching experiences during the pandemic, and their presentation will lay the groundwork for our discussion. Next, we'll hear from Professor Jamie Abrams. Professor Abrams is a professor at the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law, and she is visiting this academic year at the University of Baltimore. She writes about reproductive decision-making, gender-based violence, and legal education pedagogy. It seems fitting with the subject matter of our panel to add that she has two school-age children who last left the house for in-person school in March of 2020. Professor Abrams will present that the time is right for innovations in teaching and delivery of legal education. Following Professor Abrams will be Professor Veronica C. Gonzalez-Zamora. She is an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law and a former litigation attorney at Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck. She teaches primarily civil procedure, ethics, and poverty law. Applying what she learned in clerkships and law practice, she writes about access to justice through the lens of legal regulation, legal education, and intersectionality. For purposes of her presentation, we should note that Professor Gonzalez-Zamora is a first-year tenure-track Latina law professor with small children. Next, we'll hear from Professor Val Vidic. Professor Vidic is the Waller Lansden Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Tennessee College of Law. She teaches gender in the law as well as civil rights, federal courts, and civil procedure. She has also taught clinical law and lawyering courses. Her scholarship focuses on feminist jurisprudence and gender in the law. And fittingly with all that description, she will present on how to adapt feminist legal methods to Zoom and this online platform that we're teaching from these days. And finally, we have three presenters from Cornell Law School who will share their 10 minutes. Professor Brianna Beltran teaches in the Farm Work Legal Assistance Clinic at Cornell Law School. which represents farm workers on immigration and employment matters in New York State and beyond. Professor Beltran will present on the benefits of remote skills-based coursework for women and students of color. Next, Jacqueline Kelly Widmer is an associate clinical professor at Cornell Law School, and she teaches lawyering and in the 1L Immigration Law and Advocacy Clinic. Her clinic represents clients in DACA, citizenship, and asylum matters. Professor Widmer Kelly will be presenting on the drawbacks of that remote skills-based coursework. And we'll conclude with Professor Zora Ahmed, who teaches in the International Human Rights Clinic at Cornell Law School, which represents individuals on death row and communities struggling for self-determination. Her clients are in the US, Tanzania, and the occupied Syrian Golan. Professor Ahmed will conclude by presenting the lessons that they've learned about remote skills-based coursework for women and students of color. So we'll begin then with Professor Crawford.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to my fellow panelists who suggested a fantastic idea, which was to start with a poll of the audience. And so we'd like to, before I turn it over to Michelle Simon, who will talk about our substantive work, I wanted to do a few demographic slides, and here's how to participate. You've got two ways to participate. Open up a new text on your cell phone and address that text to 37607 panelists. You are very welcome to join in as well. And in the body of your message, send the letters WILE for Women in Legal Education, of course, and you'll be ready to roll. Or if you're on your computer, you can just open up a tab in your new browser and point to pollev.com/WILE. Okay, give folks a minute to do that, and the instructions will appear on every other screen I'm about to show. So here we go with our demographic poll, just trying to get a sense of who is in the room, So first question for you there is, which of the following best describes how many years you have been teaching or employed full-time in a law school? And you can enter A, B, C, D, E, F for the letter that corresponds to the appropriate choice for you. We're just getting a sense of who's here. All of us try on Zoom for that active learning. And so we have a range of folks in our audience. Again, if you don't know how to participate, instructions up at the very top. You can text the letters WILE to that number 37607. All right, next slide. Which of the following best describes your gender identity, however you define it: male, female, trans male, trans man, trans female, trans woman, gender queer, gender nonconforming, or a different identity? These are terms that the William Institute recommends for asking questions in surveys. So if you choose to identify, you're very welcome. And we'll flip to the next slide then. Just three more really simple questions. True or false? I have faced increasing childcare or elder care responsibilities during the pandemic. True or false? I have faced increasing childcare or elder care responsibilities during the pandemic. And we've got some mixed experience in our group. Just two more quick questions, and then I'll turn it over. This one a little more nuanced. Considering the amount of time you typically spend preparing for class during non-pandemic times, how does the amount compare with the pandemic era? You spend less time preparing for pandemic classes, somewhat less time, about the same, more time, much more time, or not applicable because you may be a new teacher with no comparator or other reasons. So less time, somewhat less, comparing the amount of time spent. Okay, and then just one more slide just to get a sense of who's in our audience, which of the following best describes how the pandemic is impacting your professional productivity, however you define it and measure it, negatively, really negatively, somewhat positively, etc. So give us your thoughts on that question as well. Why am I asking you this? This is a little flavor of the survey that Michelle Simon, my friend, colleague, and co-author, my former dean, and we'll be talking about next, discussing law faculty experiences teaching during the pandemic. Michelle, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and hopefully we'll have our PowerPoint, and here we go. And all right. So thank you, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Lisa, and thank you, of course, Bridget. So you got a little taste of the survey, and let me begin just by saying that, as we all know, last spring, we were thrust into kind of an extraordinary and involuntary shift in teaching. And as we struggled to adapt to all the new personal and professional obligations, the concerns of the Academy were, and rightfully so, focused on the impact on our students, of course, and, we had many emergency faculty meetings, as I'm sure many of you did too, making sure they had access to the internet and they had a safe place to live and learn if they had to move, what was going to happen, etc. But as the spring semester ended, we realized that there was very little formal discussion about how faculty experienced and responded to the pandemic. So we decided to conduct an informal survey to collect some data, and you get a feeling for what that survey was like with the information that Bridget just gave you. So what we did was we sent the survey to 61 colleagues in both public and private law schools, every rank and every distinction. We asked those colleagues to forward the survey to any interested colleagues that they might have. And as a result, we got 37 responses. Now, clearly, it's not a representative sample. There's no scientific validity to this survey. There were lots of issues about gender and race that were not captured by the survey. But what we do think is that it provides a snapshot of law faculty experiences during the 2020 semester. So what I'm going to do today, along with Bridget, is to highlight some of the data we received and suggest that there's a need for further discussion, and then use our own experiences to explain why we think that the institutional responses have been slow in coming. So just to go through a little of what we found, again, you were asked this question as well by Bridget. You can see that the teaching experience of the responders was skewed towards senior faculty. There can be a lot of reasons for that, and we probably will talk about some of those later on in the presentation today. But it's something that you should keep in mind as we look at some of the other data. You can see that 31% of the responders have been teaching 25 to 35 years, and only 6% of the responders were teaching 0 to 3 years. So we asked various questions. Again, it's questions as you saw. We were interested in looking at the teaching experience, but first we wanted to ask about people's home life during the spring semester. So we saw that 45% of the responders had increased childcare or elder care duties, that there were immediate family members unemployed. People were worried, 37%. 20% had a family member who was an essential worker, and 25% of the responders had more people at home, of course, either living there and not in school anymore or working remotely. But very few were fearful of food insecurity. We also wanted to find out how faculty, what had changed as a result of the pandemic in terms of teaching. So we wanted to understand how faculty time spent on teaching had changed. And you can see that 54% felt that they were spending much more time in class preparation, and only 5% were spending less time on class preparation. So there had been a pretty big shift in how people felt about class preparation. We also were interested in how it had changed with respect to time spent with students. So again, you can see that of the responders, 36% said they spent much more time with the students. 41% said that they spent less time with students as a result of the pandemic. So from these and a few other questions that were in the survey, we reached some really anecdotal and informal impressions. And I want to emphasize that we understand that there are many gender, race, and age seniority issues that need to be explored further. A few things that we concluded were that junior faculty members had added childcare responsibilities, but they also tended to be more comfortable working from home. Many had already been working from home, and they also were more comfortable with the use of technology. Senior faculty, on the other hand, most were more comfortable working in the office, and so it was a big change to all of a sudden set up at home, and many had trouble navigating basic issues with remote teaching. A lot were also worried about physically vulnerable, and many did not have people in their household who could help them with the technological issue, like those of us who have people who are teenagers or preteens who are so good at all of these things. We also saw that faculty of color were more likely to be coping with family illness, with unemployment, or the loss of loved ones as a result of the pandemic. And we suspected that women shoulder a higher percentage of childcare, elder care, and household responsibilities. We also suspected that with respect to contact with students, the faculty that were considered to be approachable before the pandemic ended up shouldering more student contact, including frequently contact with students who were not related to the course that faculty member was teaching, but other issues that came up, of course, with students during the pandemic. There are a few areas that we didn't really cover, but we'd like to explore more. And one is ways that faculty use remote classroom as a way to model professional behavior, the visual reality of home life, what happens when your cat crawls on your computer or your dog continues to bark, and how can we model that as a faculty to the students. And we continue to be concerned with the way teaching evaluations will be used, as well, of course, as issues and bias in teaching evaluations that we think were exacerbated by the pandemic. And then, of course, the impact of this huge change on scholarship and service, which will be discussed by some of my colleagues later on. I wanted to show you this next slide just to give you some idea of some of the comments that were elicited by our study when we asked faculty what they wanted their administrators to know. And you can see, I won't read through all of them, but one is, a crisis reveals people's true colors. I hope you were watching. Or support and figure out how to reward those who figure out how to do this well. So you can see that faculty are frustrated with the inequities, and they want to be recognized for the hard work that they're doing. These are feelings, I think, that are always present among faculties, but certainly They seem to be amplified by the circumstances of this pandemic. And there also seems to be a disconnect between what faculty are doing on the ground, the work that they're, the day-to-day kind of grunt work that it's taking to teach this way, and whether the administrators were paying attention or really understood how difficult it is. So why is there this disconnect, and why have administrators not paid that much attention to faculty during this pandemic? So as Lisa mentioned, I started my career as a legal writing instructor with a 3-year contract. I had an office that was in a bathroom, complete with a toilet bowl. And I eventually became a tenure track professor. I became tenured. I was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and then I served as the Dean of the Elizabeth Howe School of Law for 7 years. During that time, I raised 3 children, had all the ups and downs that we all have in our lives. And I currently am at home. There are 3 people working remotely from my home. I am the primary caretaker of my 88-year-old mother, and my daughter and my 3-year-old granddaughter live in my household. So I give you that information just to let you know that I've always, as a dean, and still, I'm very sensitive to all of these issues. And I understand that the law school dean has to balance many constituencies. This pandemic, as we all know, has impacted every part of the institution's structure. There's been a loss of revenue, both in tuition, in alumni giving, in dorm revenue. There've been all kinds of additional expenses in testing, in hardware and software. There's been illness among faculty and staff. The staff has had to work at home. The departments have new responsibility. Admissions has to figure out how to bring in a class when nobody can come to school. Student services is working overtime to deal with all the student issues. IT has become probably the most important group that we have to depend on. And so the dean is balancing, and the administration is balancing all of these interests, and sometimes the faculty can get overlooked. So what is the use of this? So I just needed to end by saying, what use is this non-representative survey, this snapshot of a particular time in American American legal education? Basically, we all care so deeply about legal education, but the future health of the academy suggests that faculty need to be supported and, more importantly, heard. And this kind of survey can be used as a jumping off point for deans to develop a more representative, inclusive instrument to cull information about what their faculty needs. And that in turn will lead to even a better experience for our students. Thank you. Okay, I'm stopping my share.
All right. Thank you, Professor Simon. And now we'll listen to Professor Abrams.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me just make sure my slides are working and they're working in the right format. Is that good? Is there anything I need to do to make them go one at a time on the screen? Okay, perfect. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to the organizers. And I know we all start with that. It's just like the pro forma way to start a presentation. But I want to add just like a really heartfelt coda to that, which is to say that when this call for papers came out, it hit me at hands down the most vulnerable moment in my entire career. And so the chance to sort of focus my energies and my emotions and the vulnerabilities toward a productive paper and a project that channeled all that I have been experiencing was an incredibly important professional moment. So I think it's so wonderful that we have leaders in this section who had the vision to put something like this together. And I'm so grateful for the chance to be a part of it. My abstract was half substantive and half a call for therapy, I think, in this moment. I do want to start, though, by noting the profound irony that we, a panel on power and gender and teaching and the obstacles that many of us uniquely face in our teaching through this pandemic, were assigned a slot in AALS between 4:15 and 5:30 p.m. And that really struck me. And I realize it's luck of the draw and it just happens. But the fact that my participation in this involves shoving devices in my kids' faces for, a couple of hours, the irony is not lost on me of the challenges that we all face in this moment. But my project is called this pandemic paradox. And what I'm looking at in this project, it's really a couple of papers sort of pulled together for this presentation. The first piece of it is looking at the chronology and the trajectory of feminist and other critical voices pushing for pedagogical and curricular reforms in what I describe as sort of steady drumbeat of a call for reform that has sounded for over 50 years. And so through that steady drumbeat, critical voices have pushed to reform legal education and have achieved many lasting reforms. So we have achieved significant improvements in access to legal education and specialized courses, materials, in creating wonderful feminist spaces that are so vital to our thriving in this profession, like the one we have here today. And those are the courses and the materials and the spaces have proven to be a mainstay and a lifeline for many faculty. But of course, we all know we also have a tremendous agenda in front of us, an agenda that if we look in the last 100 years, law school really looks remarkably the same in total. There is wonderful innovation, but much of that innovation is happening around the margins, or is happening around that core traditional center of the same power systems that drive and shape legal education. The Socratic method still dominates, and these really hierarchical, adversarial, and competitive cultures that shape classrooms, faculty meetings, hiring processes, et cetera. We also see tremendous career segmentation still plaguing women faculty of color, bias, grave disproportionalities in our service commitments and the value that those commitments receive, and then this pushing headwind against so many careers of this presumption of incompetence that we need to push through in teaching and scholarship. And so I want to sort of juxtapose that. So I describe that in my paper as this drumbeat of just driving forward with these calls for reform. And I think that stands in profound contrast to what happened last year, where literally in a flip of a switch, we transformed teaching, and not in ways that we all love, not in ways that we want to sustain, not in ways that any of us asked for, but nonetheless, we did. We flipped a switch. It was frenzied, it was flawed, it was fast, it was imperfect, but we reformed how we taught. And there were some good things about it. A lot of the transformations that were happening in classrooms were actually quite collaborative. I know Bridget was a big part of this, and many other, putting together cohorts of scholars to come together, teachers to come together and think about, what is this going to look like in a wills and trusts classroom? What is this going to look like in a family law classroom? What is this going to look like in a torts classroom? New collaboration within our fields, within our institutions. I know more people on my campus than I ever knew before, working with other departments, learning from each other. And the reforms that happened were consistent and systemic nationwide. We all, private, public, whatever tier or ranking, we all had to change the way we teach and the way we think about teaching. And from that, I think it is important that we do have this sort of tipping point in front of us. And it would be, I think, quite a loss to just go back, to shut Zoom down and just go back doing exactly what we were doing before, particularly when we have a robust scholarship over 70 years from so many people who've said hello in the chat, who have written so many important things for over half a century demanding and seeking curricular reform. So we've seen pushes from all sorts of critical voices to move away from this competitive, abstract, cutthroat, adversarial classroom and culture of law school and law, and pushing for a more critical voices pushing for law school framed more around problem solving, relationships, cooperation, context, and at least anecdotally, in my experience, some of the most exciting transformations I've seen are faculty thinking about assessment and groups and using dynamics of classrooms coming together in new ways. Importantly, the Socratic method has always been sort of the epicenter, a big portion of the critique of existing pedagogy. And I have a couple of sort of signature quotes here. Catherine McKinnon's is my favorite, calling the Socratic method an ejaculatory means of teaching. And, just a long-standing critique that this isn't effective, that it's particularly ineffective on communities of color and on women students and on non-traditional students, that it's positioning, power and professor at the center instead of the kinds of things our students need to move forward. But what struck me particularly about looking at the sort of historic calls for reform and the steady drumbeat over a half a century is the idea that many have been calling for decades to suggesting that institutions have an obligation, that this isn't something that should be happening episodically in my classroom or your classroom or a few devoted believers, but this is an obligation, an institutional commitment to make education accessible and inclusive to all of our students. But nonetheless, we still find ourselves with our entire legal education really framed on this historic architecture, a sort of crumbling yet revered foundation around a Socratic classroom and a tremendous reverence. In the early pandemic emails and blogs and questions, this question, how can we do the Socratic? Like the idea that we might not need the Socratic or we might move away from the Socratic method seemed unthinkable, I think, to many. And so I talk in the project about how a lot of our exciting innovations have happened sort of around this really traditional architecture of the Socratic classroom. And then I talk about what I call the pandemic paradox, this painful and raw truth that the exact communities that have spent over half a century advocating for these types of reforms in the classrooms are the exact communities of scholars and teachers and leaders who are the least able in this exact moment to advocate and fight, because we've burnt up our political capital, we've burnt up the social capital on our faculty because we're exhausted, we're fatigued. And for women of color, this is exacerbated in searing and even more profound ways as we rely so heavily on our faculty of color and our women faculty of color to help through the racial justice issues in our communities and in our law schools as well. And so I sort of call this the pandemic paradox, that the exact communities who know we're at this tipping point are least able in this moment to do what it takes to get there, to prioritize this type of advocacy. And I have here, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but just a few sort of obvious points that now following the survey that Bridget did early on, but this idea that we're spending more time caregiving, less time in productivity. So I'll skip that for here. But the takeaways for my project are two things. So first, I advocate for what I call an inclusion imperative, or if you want to be more pop culture about it, I call it canceling Kingsfield. The idea that using cancel culture, the idea of canceling culture is to disinvest, to say, you don't get my presumptive reverence anymore, you need to earn it back, right? And I feel like that's the sort of, when I describe the Kingsfield culture, I'm referring to a power-centered and a professor-centered classroom that uses masculinist techniques that are consistent with these longstanding critiques. And so when we come back to this classroom, I think we should stop revering and fearing and celebrating this type of teaching technique and squarely ground the Socratic tradition in techniques that are student-centered, client-centered, and skill-centered, and abandon techniques that are power-centered and professor-centered. And so that's the sort of what I call like an inclusion imperative, the idea that we know these techniques have not worked for decades and that they're overtly harmful in some performances of it. And I actually, in the project, embrace fully the Socratic method in some capacity because it's scalable, because we know it, because it works with the existing economics and infrastructure of our schools. But the challenge that I make is to the performances of it that are in that power-centered, professor-centered tradition. And then second and last, I present what I call an equity imperative. And what I mean by that is we have in our new ABA standards, strong edicts from our licensing procedures that we need to create learning outcomes. But these learning outcomes, the only thing that the ABA tasks law schools with doing in implementing these learning outcomes is to measure them and then to, quote, take steps when we know that these learning outcomes are not being achieved by communities of students. The only edict is to take steps to resolve them. And so that's what I call this equity imperative, this idea that we need a lens, and the lens that we need to apply to these learning outcomes is making sure that whatever techniques we're using, whatever outcomes we seek to achieve are done in a way that are inclusive and create an effective classroom for all of our communities of learners. So that's my contribution, and I look forward to chatting after, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Great. All right. Thanks, Professor Abrams. Now we'll hear from Professor Gonzalez-Zamora.
Great. Thanks very much, Lisa. And thank you, Jamie. That was fantastic. I'm going to be talking today about how super moms are struggling, the consequences of social isolation for women faculty. And I also want to echo Jamie and just really reiterate my own investment in documenting this moment. This probably will not be the last pandemic or the last challenge that we face as women law faculty. And as a junior faculty, I'm very invested in creating the kind of workplace culture that I want. So I was inspired to research this because I realized at one point, moms are finally home, right? We wanted this for so long. We didn't want to have to send our kids off places. We wanted to be home with them, to raise them and care for them. And that finally happened with the pandemic. But why are so many moms reporting that they're feeling depressed? What challenges are unique to identity, and what are institutions doing to help? So I want to start by first just defining what is a super mom. And it's two things, and you often find it in pop culture, but also psychology, anthropology, and sociology scholarship. And essentially boils down to two things. One is a cultural representation of femininity. And it's a mom essentially who's able to cope with all the demands of life. And they're all competing, and there are more than one person should be able to handle, but she's able to do it without much help, and she's happy to do it. Secondly, it is also a gender performance, right? Some moms, particularly young moms who are new to motherhood, feel like they have to be able to perform this balancing act with little to no help and meet all of the competing demands. And the downside is that gender performance can mask the true feelings, including depression. So what is the secret to the success of super moms? Well, behind the scenes, there's a lot of planning that goes on. There are deep social networks, including partners and mentors and parents and siblings and what Jamie described as social and political capital that are helping super moms, right? Maybe that's taking your kids to soccer practice or dropping them off afterward, or tutoring your child who's having difficulty in math, or maybe that's somebody who comes to clean your home every so often. But it essentially plays out differently for different races, different age groups, and different socioeconomics. For example, if you are somebody who's experiencing financial strain, you might live in a multi-generational household. Millennials, for example, live in multi-generational households because they have decreased rates of homeownership based on entering the workforce during a pandemic, during a recession. In addition, some faculty also sort of uproot and move to a different institution, different city, and sort of have to start building a new network. And so they also may have different, this may play out differently for those folks. In particular, for women of color, the way it plays out varies, of course, by geography and race. But for Latinas and other ethnic and racial groups, there is a concept called familismo. And essentially, it's this family-centeredness. And it's not the typical, like, I love my children a lot, family-centeredness.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Professor Gonzalez-Zamora, but could we have the slides advance or change?
Let's see. I'm advancing on my screen. Are they not advancing on your screen?
They are not advancing on our screen, so okay, we're not seeing restart. That. I apologize because you were on such a roll.
I'm sorry. Which screen did you all leave at?
We are all on the first title slide.
Oh, really? Oh, geez. I'm so sorry. Okay. Well, let me try this again. Share.
And then we're getting requests for the presentation, so we will be able to upload that later.
Sure. Okay, so I was in slideshow mode, so I'm just going to stick to this mode here. Is that okay?
Thank you so much.
Good. So this was my inspiration for research. This is what is a super mom, so I can catch you up on all of the really cool images I have. How it plays out differently for different races and ages. And here's where we left off. For Latinas and other groups, feminismo is really not just a value, but a core value, right? This translates to interconnectedness and interdependence. So the family becomes not only a source of emotional and really material support, including financial support, but also the person feels a sense of obligation toward the rest of the family, right? And this originated when families were migrating and are still migrating to the United States, and they had to pool resources together. So if somebody had some income, they could make a small loan to somebody, or parents often will take care of children so that their children can pursue higher education. Those are some examples. But essentially, the core value is the idea that adults keep these really strong physical and emotional bonds with their family members, even when they have attained some measure of independence. So the COVID ceiling is what I'm calling this. It's essentially the lack of childcare coupled with decreased self-care. And of course, this includes schooling from home if you have young children, has led to two really important consequences. One is the productivity deficit, which others have mentioned, and the other is psychological distress. And these are barriers essentially to the workplace, and they exacerbate gender advancement and equity in law faculty in particular. So here's one example of something sort of funny. I posted this on my social media because I felt like it really described how I was feeling. People kept telling me, wow, you're super mom, you're super human. And it's like, I'm really not doing it. I feel like I'm drowning. I feel like I'm, not doing all the pieces as well as I could have, right? And this is true for other circles of women that I've been having conversations with. One is a group of 7 women at my law school. Another is a group of 4 women in a writing group. And then I also have 2 sisters with young children at home while they're working full time. So essentially what I realized early on in the pandemic is that the normal adaptations that I had, the normal coping mechanisms I had for competing demands were not working, right? Because of COVID's social distancing requirements, higher rates of sickness and mortality for elderly people and Latino people, I could no longer rely on my normal social network, right? And this was a challenge for everybody, not just women of color, but especially women of color. It became this sort of constant negotiation and mediation of being a good parent or being a good citizen, right? Do I have this closeness and interconnectedness with my family, or do I have this, or do I follow the regulations in my particular state or the WHO recommendations, the World Health Organization? And you can add a third layer to this, which is a good corporate citizen. Moms often ask themselves things like, should I volunteer for that? Should I take the lead on that? Things like that. Should I show up to this event that I've been invited to? And of course, this all leads to additional layers of stress. The lack of childcare, as has been discussed, it's been discussed in the literature for a long time. There's, not adequate childcare, but as I mentioned, women have sort of adapted so that they could be in leadership roles and faculty roles. But without these deep social networks, whether it's family or hired help, women are taking on more roles. And there was a study at UNM by the Advanced Group, which looked at what it meant for women to be working from home while we were transitioning to online teaching. And what they discovered is that in 3 hours, the parent on duty was interrupted 45 times. And the average length of uninterrupted work time was 3 minutes and 24 seconds. 3 minutes and 24 seconds. I'll say that again. I mean, can you really get the deep level of knowledge production? Can you really do that in 3 minutes and 24 seconds? No. And the reality is, researchers have shown that it takes 20 minutes or more to regain focus after being interrupted. So if it takes 20 minutes to regain focus, but you only have 3-minute blocks, you essentially have no opportunity to focus. So many of my colleagues were working late at night, early in the morning when their kids were asleep, things like that. And of course, this also leads to feelings of inadequacy, hopelessness, despair. Women are also carrying higher burdens than men in two-parent households. And of course, single women or single parent homes, that person is carrying the entire burden. Women on average spend about 15 hours more per week on domestic labor. So generally speaking, there was an addition of about 30 hours per week to a total of 60 hours per week for both parents. But women have taken on the extra 22 hours and men have taken on about 7 hours. And of course, lack of self-care means that women have more vulnerable mental health. And 49% of mothers in April show at least mild symptoms of psychological distress, which I'm sure has increased knowing what we know now, right? That there are different groups of people who are more susceptible to the virus. This has potential consequences for legal education in particular, including mentorship of women law students. There will be fewer women law faculty who can engage in advocacy for women's rights, fewer women law faculty who can engage in knowledge production related to women's issues, such as breastfeeding in prison or the Crown Act. Those kinds of things will lose momentum as women are not able to be as productive or leaving the workforce altogether. And of course, there are many other consequences, including relational ones, to the relationship between partners, relationship between parents and children, that all have this strain on them. And particularly for women of color who have this family-centeredness, can also feel the tension with relationships outside the home. There are several solutions in literature. Most of them say that women, to feel better, should just lower their own expectations. But I think that only works if the institution also lowers its expectations. And there's some ways to do that, right? Course releases, having decreased service requirements, like not having to show up to every single meeting, or receiving an update about the meeting afterward. Things like that would be really helpful. But really what we need is the institution to begin reconstructing the safety net that they've benefited from for so long. So the point I want to leave you with is this. It's not business as usual. Even supermoms have limits. Thanks very much.
Thank you. There's lots of chat in the chat about feeling both exhausted, being reminded about the extra work that we have, and also feeling validated by the recognition that we know we don't have a lot of time, and being interrupted 45 times might actually be, for some of us, maybe a little bit under the actual number. So somebody suggested that your alternate finale slide should be that wine only heals so much, and I can totally relate to that one. So somebody also put in the chat a link to an article that why women volunteer for tasks that don't lead to promotions. So that is also will be an interesting thing to look at as well. But let's go now to Professor Vidic, and we can certainly cover this and more when we get to questions at the end. So Professor Vidic?
Sure. Like Jamie, I received this notice of the call for papers at a time that was perfect for me. I was struggling and working with how to transform my class. I teach gender and the law, and I've taught that class for the past 20 years. The course explores the relationship between law, gender, race, and power. And it's my favorite course to teach, and the most challenging as well. So like many others, my teaching has been grounded in the methods identified by Catherine Bartlett in her seminal article, Feminist Legal Methods. Professor Bartlett identified basic strategies used in feminist legal theory to interrogate legal rules. These include asking the woman question, feminist practical reasoning, and consciousness raising. In contrast to traditional legal analysis, Bartlett explains, these methods value, quote, personal narrative over abstract analysis, risk-taking and vulnerability over caution and detachment, close quote. So using these methods in the past, my brick and mortar classroom morphs from a collection of students into a community of learners. About halfway through the class, participants began to share their lived experience, and in that process raised critical questions about the gendered assumptions and consequences embodied in our legal system. So in August, I began to ponder, how do you do that when your classroom is on Zoom? Separated by space, how do we create a virtual learning community in which feminist legal methods can flourish? Today, I'd like to share my experience with this challenge in the hopes of starting a conversation about best practices on Zoom. First, I will discuss my process for redesigning the course for Zoom. Second, I'll briefly highlight some of the methods I chose to use. And third, I'll conclude with some lessons learned. So first, my process. In redesigning the course, I decided to go back to first principles. What were my goals for the course? What methods did I want to use to advance those goals? I'd been teaching it for a long time, but like many of us, you tend to start doing the same things. So I actually really welcomed this opportunity to think about these important questions again and with a fresh eye. I thought about what it meant for a classroom to be feminist. Bell Hooks writes, quote, "Feminist education, the feminist classroom, is and should be a place where there is a sense of struggle, where there is visible acknowledgement of the union of theory and practice, where we work together as teachers and students to overcome the estrangement and alienation that have become so much the norm in the contemporary university," close quote. This seemed particularly apt for teaching during this pandemic. I reread Bartlett's text, and I chose to focus on two feminist methods this semester to teach and practice. I used others, of course, but these were the two primary ones I wanted to focus on. The first method is feminist practical reasoning, or reasoning from context. This method situates legal issues as problems involving, quote, multiple perspectives, contradictions, and inconsistencies, close quote. The second method is consciousness raising, which Bartlett describes as bearing witness. It invites participants to share their own experiences of patriarchy, racism, heteronormativity, and other forms of oppression, to make meaning of them with others who also share and articulate their experiences. Both of these methods are informed by theories of positionality and intersectionality, honed by Kimberly Crenshaw and many others. In my experience, they empower students to use their lived experience to interrogate gendered and racialized rules, and to collectively envision new ways of framing and addressing legal issues. The Vanderbilt Center on Learning explains that these type of practices recognize, quote, that knowledge is constructed in community rather than in isolation, close quote. For these methods to succeed, professors must cultivate a space for students to engage in deep conversation, to create a community for students to engage collaboratively in this production of knowledge. So I next considered how to translate these goals and methods to the Zoom virtual classroom. And here are some of the things I did. I'm sure a number of you did the same. First, I chose to be more explicit about my teaching and learning goals and methods. In my syllabus, I spelled out my expectations and goals for creating a collaborative learning community. Now, I've done something similar in the past, but this time I wanted to create a structure that I could refer back to, a model of what our community could look like. So I wrote, my goal is to allow us to build a learning community where we can cultivate meaningful conversations and critically explore the legal approach to gender and how it impacts people's lived experiences. I then defined the skills and tools that I wanted the course to cultivate to achieve that. And I included curiosity, self-reflection, active listening, and effective communication. Second, I assigned students to participate in small group discussions before each Zoom class. I wanted to give them the opportunity to get to know each other and build community outside of the classroom. So I assigned questions and problems rather than just say, go discuss. And I allowed them to choose which ones to ponder. Third, I used a discussion board and incorporated collaborative assignments. So after each group assignment, I asked every group to prepare a summary of their discussion and to post it in advance on the board for us to read in advance of the class. Another tactic was I more deliberately and explicitly modeled feminist methods. I really went back and thought, what do I do in an actual classroom to promote discussion, to promote people sharing of their own experiences and discussion of their own perspectives? And I realized that I shared my own personal experiences, which gives students the permission to do the same. You know, as law professors in the first year, we tend to teach students how to think like a lawyer, which traditionally has meant to not think about your personal experiences, to learn how to reason from abstract principles, to fight the hypothetical. And so I find that encouraging students by modeling self-disclosure is a way to get them to realize this is a valuable form of knowledge. I began to label my own use of methodology more. This is practical reasoning, or your experience has made me think more deeply about this topic. Lessons learned. One, students need value. Students need and value connection. Repeatedly, they told me how much they appreciated the opportunity for small group discussion. Second, I realized it's helpful to provide explicit prompts for students to learn and practice feminist methods, especially if you're doing it asynchronously. It goes along with naming. So one thing I want to do in the future is to be more explicit. For example, to say to students, please describe what you learned from a classmate and how it impacted your thinking. And the last point, consider complementing synchronous discussion with asynchronous discussion boards. I actually used this board in my federal courts class a little more than in my gender class. And I found it was a really wonderful opportunity for students to be quite reflective. They wrote wonderful posts, and some of them commented how important it was to them to be able to be reflective and to prepare their participation rather than to verbally express it in class. Again, this is just the beginning of a conversation. My time is running up, and I want to allow time for discussion. So thank you for your attention. And I look forward to hearing your experiences and your ideas and hope that we can continue this discussion later. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Vidic. Somebody in the chat mentioned, thanked all the panelists, thanks to all the panelists for their work. They commented that their institution seemed to add events last spring once everyone went online to Zoom, which seemed counterintuitive to this person, given how everyone was struggling with additional burdens. But I think it reflects the pre-pandemic masculine idea that if we're not always holding events, workshops, panels, etc., that we don't have a vibrant intellectual community, and it privileges those within the institution who don't have these disparate responsibilities. So I'd like to maybe have us keep that comment in mind and have some response to that during our question and answer session. But right now we'll move to Professor Beltran to talk about the benefits of remote skills-based work for women and students of color.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And just, I think on behalf of the group of the three of us from Cornell, we just really appreciate being part of this roundtable, I guess. We've learned so much, and I think there's a lot that we, that resonated with us. So just to recap, the three of us, Zora, Jackie, and I are all clinical instructors, and I think we bring sort of a different perspective in that regard. you'll see throughout our presentation that we tend to have, in clinic, we tend to have pretty close relationships with our students already. Some of that was good, some of that was bad in terms of remote learning. And just want to flag that from the start. So I'm going to go ahead and start by talking about the benefits that we kind of experienced during the past nearly a year of remote teaching. So I think the main overarching one is just, we've all been here for many months now on Zoom, and we've come to really realize, of course, that everyone's little box on Zoom is the same size, right? That can be beneficial for students who maybe otherwise didn't necessarily feel like they were equally positioned in some more traditional classes in the physical law school. I think even before all of the, before COVID, we would often hear from our students, a lot of times women and students of color, even students who maybe were more public interest oriented, that they didn't always feel as comfortable or that they fit in as much in these classroom settings. And I think clinic already offered a space for that, and even more so when everyone was sort of equally positioned in our little Zoom boxes. And part of that is also us as instructors, right? That our boxes are the same too. And students we are supervising and working with get to see us in our homes just as we got to see them in their homes, all the good, bad, and ugly that may have come with that. I think one thing that the three of us really found when we were preparing for this presentation is that because of the sort of close relationships that we had with students already, because of the nature of clinic, that this was actually fairly, I don't know if easy is the right word, but it came more naturally, I guess, when we were working with students last spring. We already had close relationships with students, and sort of going through this process together of having to shift to online and being home and being in new settings and adapting, but still keeping up our case and client obligations. It was we had a good foundation for that with those students. And then finally, in terms of access, we had easier access in some ways to others outside of our, us and the students. That may be guest speakers that we were more easily able to bring to class now that it was online. We didn't have to bring someone all the way out to Ithaca to be a guest speaker in class. But we also had to sort of adapt with our clients, right? We couldn't necessarily just go meet face-to-face with our clients anymore. We had to set up a Zoom call, or we had to do phone or WhatsApp for some clients who communicate in that method. And I will say, in our clinic, we already did a lot of that in terms of representing clients who were not nearby. So we had this sort of long distance lawyer-client relationship. But now even more students got to, had to, I guess, go through that and learn to adapt and develop not only the skills, which I think is useful for, a skills course, but also for a bigger picture perspective. Learning the lessons, important access to justice lessons, and that not only can you represent clients nearby who can come into your office, but you can represent people from afar, and they have just as much a need to be able to have their rights vindicated or their voices heard. And I think that was a big lesson for us all over the past year. So I think with that, I will turn it over now to Jackie, who is going to talk about the flip side of this.
Thanks, Brianna. Thanks so much. I'll discuss just briefly some of the drawbacks that we found both in the clinics and in the lawyering space. I teach in both clinic and lawyering, and so I'll just go over these few drawbacks before Zora resolves them a little bit for us. The first one is just participation. We know often that in the structures of law school, women and students of color, and sometimes students with non-typical learning styles, find it more difficult to participate or are more hesitant to participate in our classes. And we definitely also see that happen in some cases via Zoom. And for us as instructors, it's a little bit more difficult for us to get the same type of participation that we might be able to get in the classroom. For example, when I'm teaching in person, I can notice when someone might seem to have an idea or their body language suggests to me that they want to make a contribution, but they're feeling kind of hesitant. And so sometimes I can encourage that that student to participate, or maybe just that side of the room to participate, and get over that tentative feeling for some students. And that's almost impossible to pick up on over Zoom and in virtual learning environments. Of course, also the typical zoning out that can happen. We've been on a long call just now, and it's the end of the week and the end of the day, so we all know what zoning out is over Zoom. It's harder to pay attention when we've been on Zoom all day, although this panel has been totally riveting to me. Next, I just want to talk about some of the other nuances of virtual relationship building. As clinical instructors, we need to know our students really well because we have to trust them and entrust them with real casework for clients that have some real issues that we want to resolve for them. And in the spring, when we first shifted to the virtual learning, as Brianna mentioned, we kind of just transitioned our formerly live relationship into virtual spaces. And that was simpler, but it's more difficult to create these kind of connections with students that you don't already know and with whom you can't have these more casual connections. We don't have the same type of ability for drop-in hours or running into students in the hallway. There's not ways for students to always bring to us some of the particular challenges that they may have. For example, mental health issues or other kinds of personal family type struggles. For example, this summer, I was working with some students on immigration cases, and one of my students was suffering from an anxiety disorder that he had anyway before COVID. But in light of COVID, it was really impacting him. It was impacting his ability to participate in our casework. But I also only saw him very briefly for Zoom meetings, and he did not reveal his struggles to me until about 2 months into the summer. And if I had known, I would have adapted his workload or working style to accommodate that situation. And so this is a challenge that can happen, especially in skills courses with Zoom. And then finally, just the different sort of structural challenges that come with Zoom. We see students with different home situations, professors with different home situations, as we've discussed, but students who are parents, who have maybe big families who they live with, or students who are alone and completely isolated. These folks may have different challenges in participating. The gaze into your space that reduces the privacy. It can be hard to have a confidential discussion with a student when there are other people in the room. I had a student this summer who lived in a small apartment, and the only space she could meet with me was in her kitchen, and I would always see her mom cooking in the background. It's kind of hard to have a confidential client discussion in that situation. And then just finally, burnout and fatigue. We meet with a lot of students who are on screens all day. We are on screens all day, and that definitely is a drawback for virtual learning. But I will turn it to Zora to talk about what we've learned.
Hi, all. This is a hard task to be the last person at 5:22 Eastern time, but I will wrap it all up on a positive note. I think some of the things that we learned from remote clinical teaching and how it affects students of color, women of color, underrepresented groups will be fairly obvious, but I'll just highlight them here. I think, first of all, what's clear is that clinics lend themselves to the kind of flexibility that was required when we all went into remote teaching. And that skill building itself can be a real way to building community. And in a time of pandemic, in a time of social isolation and of political upheaval, building community is all the more important. And so I think skill building lends itself to it. And so I think it may be worth considering how community building and skill building can be incorporated more routinely throughout the curriculum to ensure that social isolation, whether because of a pandemic or because of structural factors, can be overcome. One of the ways that we overcame alienation that our students can feel rooted in their histories of oppression or their difference is to use a range of different communication tools. We switched and used a lot on Slack, and we created a separate channel for students to post random things that were humorous or related to what was going on in their lives that would compensate for the lack of casual chatter in the classroom or outside of the hallways that is so essential to community building and that is so essential to building that interpersonal relationship. And the other piece that we incorporated was to have check-ins at the beginning of each of our supervision meetings, which are on a daily basis as supervisors. And that means asking students to just give a word or two about how they're feeling, and for us as teachers to participate in that. And so I think that invitation for vulnerability, both from our end and for students, was critical for us to be able to check in on people about how they were doing, but also to show that, at times we were struggling too. And by asking them to extend generosity to us, I feel like they let us in as well. And I think it was sort of critical to building a relationship. And I think finally, like I said, we really tried to build in opportunities to keep it light. We shared, dog videos, dog photographs. I mean, that sounds really silly, but those are the things that you talk about in between classes. And so you have to formalize it in order to make the classroom much more inclusive and to compensate for people's learning and, personalities and styles. And I think part of clinical teaching, of course, is that we always have a client in mind, and having a client in mind who's often dealing with much more dire circumstances can also be a way to keep me grounded, to keep our students grounded. It can be humbling to sort of make the stakes clear of legal education. Of course, we have to balance it without making our students into martyrs, and to always consider, where they're coming from, and to always incorporate self-care. But we try to balance the client-centeredness, the importance of prioritizing our clients' needs with those daily check-ins, and giving students the permission to take time off to care for themselves, and being in regular communication, whether through Slack or supervision meetings, where it was the way that we struck that balance. So those are some of the lessons, and looking forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you so much.
Had to happen, right? It had to happen. Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed. So we did get a comment, presenters, that no one was zoning out, that you all were great. So thank you. We did have a lot of comments in the chat when the discussion was about, everything seeming to turn over to Zoom, and then there was just much more of it. And after I made that one comment, that somebody repeated that one comment somebody put in the chat, there was more about spending the summer in meetings over Zoom where they had never had meetings of that sort before, spending all day in meetings on Zoom, and just that Zoom fatigue. Then there were comments a little later about that lack of judging students' lack of engagement, or trying to engage them, I should say, that you can do so easily in the classroom that is so much harder online. So I present that now to open that up to the panel. Is there anything anyone wants to say or to add to that discussion? Nothing from our panelists, our presenters here. One of the comments also talked about using Slack or otherwise differentiating between the community building opportunities and the real work meetings is hugely helpful. Some frustration would be alleviated by just that simple signaling. And I thought that was a great idea. Professor Ahmed and at Cornell, of just having that sort of casual, trying to replicate that casual in-between class, before class connection that students had, that we had with our students, when you could sort of hear what they were talking about and join a conversation and just have it be light and casual. I think that's really important. And that is much harder to do on Zoom, at least, at the start of a Zoom class. It just doesn't work the same way. We have 2 more minutes left. If there are any other questions or comments from our listeners, or if there are any other questions or statements that the presenters would like to add, we did talk about forming sort of Zoom support groups, more Zooming, because of the pandemic and some of the isolation and all the other things that our presenters talked about in terms of, lower productivity, some people in writing groups having to sort of help lift their productivity. So if that's interesting to anybody who's on the other side of the screen here, let me know and I will put you in touch with the presenters who most had most talked about that. And I'm just sort of waiting a little bit to see if there's any response. If not, it is Friday and it is 5:30 on the East Coast, 4:30 here in Milwaukee, and I think it's time to just wrap up our Zoom fatigue for the day. So I want to thank you very much to all the presenters here, and thank you to everyone who showed up this late in the day on a Friday, and have a wonderful rest of AALS. Try to be well, be rested, and get prepared for our second semester. And thank you.